Hello everyone, I'm Prof. Dorien Herremans from Singapore University of Technology and Design, or SUTD, and today I'll be sharing a little bit about automatic music generation to you. First, a little bit about myself. I am a professor at SUTD where I teach data science and AI, but I also lead the AMAAI Audio, Music and AI Lab. We do a bunch of research on things like using AI for automatic music generation, automatic music transcription, hit prediction, audio classification, etc. I'm also a director of the game lab there. Before coming to Singapore, I was at the Center for Digital Music at Queen Mary University of London, where I also worked on music generation. Before that, going further back, I did my PhD in applied economics at the University of Antwerp, where I've also done my master in business engineering before. I also worked for a while in Switzerland. You see a photo of our beautiful campus on the right there. The photo on the left is the campus in Antwerp, also very gorgeous. Right, so today we'll first start a little bit about the brief early history on music generation systems. Okay, where are we coming from and where are we today? Then we'll talk about different approaches to generating music without going into too much technical detail. And we'll start by a rule-based approach, how to generate counterpoint, moving towards more cutting-edge techniques like machine learning. I'll talk about my system MorpheuS and some new novel ways to generate music in a controllable way, where you have some high-level control over the music. Okay. So let's start with a brief early history of music generation systems. You might be familiar with something called the musical dice game, or the musikalisches Würfelspiel. A lot of people attribute this to Mozart. In fact, the actual origin is from Johann Philipp Kernberger in 1757. Back then it was called der Allzeitfertigen Menuetten- and Polonaise-Komponist. So this was a game that was intended to compose minuets and polonaise. How does it work? You basically roll the dice and then chance decides which bar you're going to play first. So first the composer supplies something like you see in the picture on the right. So each of the bars is labeled, bar 1, 2, 3, and this is given by the composer. Then by rolling the dice, you actually select the order in which to play the bars. So one of the sort of transition matrices can be as follows. If you roll a 6 and you're currently at bar 6, let's say, then you play bar 49. Okay. So that's a possible way how it can work. This is what they call dice tables. It's been adapted by many other composers, including Mozart, and they're actually pretty nice. Let's listen to a little example. Right, so pretty straightforward, a nice way to actually have statistical inspired music. Okay, so let's come a little bit closer in time to where we are now. If we look at John Cage, I'm sure you're all familiar with John Cage, the composer. John Cage created a lot of statistically inspired pieces. But one famous example, for instance, is Atlas Ellipticalis. So what did he do to compose Atlas Ellipticalis? He basically took a star chart, like you see in the picture, and then he put musical bars over it, musical bars like the 5 lines, and then wherever the stars were notes in his composition. Okay, a little bit less harmonic and orderly, let's say, as Polonaise composers, but it sounds something like this. Okay, goes on for quite a while. They must be outside of a galaxy because it seems like the notes are quite sparse. If we move on, we have Charles Dodge's The Earth's Magnetic Field, which was composed in 1970. And basically, Charles Dodge mapped magnetic field data from scientific reports to musical sounds. Again, the result is very avant-garde. So from very early on, there's been a drive for people to compose music based on chance or rules or probabilities, at least from the artists as we've seen, but also from science the idea came up. Does somebody recognize this lady? Sorry, I can't see a raise of hands. But this one, this lady on the photo is Ada Lovelace, which is sometimes referred to as the world's first programmer. Because if you're familiar with something called the difference engine or the analytical engine, which is on the photo here, which is one of the first programmable computers, it worked with a steam engine. Yes, a steam engine as power source. And it takes as input these punch cards, so the big cards with holes in them, to accept programming. And Lady Lovelace was one of the first assistants of Charles Dodge, who created this engine, and she deciphered his notes and was the first one to actually create these cards of programs for the machines. And it was Lovelace who said that the engine, referring to the first computer really, the engine's operating mechanism might act upon other things besides numbers. And then she says, for instance, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. So back as early as 1840, the idea that computers might be able to compose music was already there. Okay. It wasn't until actually more modern day computers were invented that we got to actually see the result of this. For instance, you might be familiar with the AMAAI computer, which was created in the 50s. Now, based on this AMAAI computer, Lejarn Hiller and Leonard Isaacson composed something that they call the AMAAI suite, which is often referred to as the first computer-generated piece. They used rules from music and statistical models, Markov models, to create this piece of music. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with AMAAI computer. Again, it's shown in the photo. And the way you program AMAAI computer is by actually, there's all these holes here, and it's by actually creating patch cables to connect different slots. So people go around a whole day to program this machine and connect patches of cables around the room. In fact, actually, there were about 6 women who were hired to do this task, and the women doing this were actually referred to as computers. So in a sense, the first computers were women. Maybe that's why all the AI voices are women as well. So this AMAAI suite is a string quartet. Let's have a listen to it. Okay, so it's a bit more coherent than the Atlas Ellipticalis, but it could still use some improvement. Still quite impressive for the time. So ever since then, computer-generated music has become a hobby of some composers. For instance, Yannis Xenakis created Analogic A in 1958. He uses Markov transition matrices to create this piece. And what is a Markov transition matrix? It's basically, we have a matrix that lists all of the possible notes. Let's say C, C sharp, D, E, etc., on both axes. Okay, and then it lists the probabilities of if you're in this note, what is the probability of your next note being an E? Perhaps quite high. Right, the probability of if you're on a C to go to a C sharp might be actually quite low. Okay, so this is how a Markov transition matrix looks like in the most simple form. This is a first order model. There are more complicated models too. So basically it can be sort of represented or drawn as pixel intensities, these values, whereby you have one note and then you have a high chance of going to this note or a lower chance of going to that note. Okay, right. So let's listen to this analogic A. Right, so still very modern or avant-garde sounding. Then there's something a little bit more structured, which is fractal music. In mathematics, you might be familiar with the term fractals, which is a technique of drawing, creating things based on ratios that occur naturally in mathematics. You might have seen these images, which are also generated using fractal algorithms. I'm not going to go into the mathematics here, but it can be a simple principle like in the tree. You draw a line, you cut the line in half, you draw another line half the length, and then you sort of continue this process. Okay, very roughly. Now, if we do apply similar techniques to music, we get something like this. So a lot more nice or conformed than the other music. So then there's David Cope. You might have heard of him. He's quite famous in the generative music scene. David Cope creates these algorithms, and one of his first published works was Experiments in Musical Intelligence. Back in 1981, Cope was suffering from composer's block. So he thought, why don't I model the rules I use to compose and put all these rules in a computer model? Then when I'm out of inspiration, I can use this model to create something in my own style and later in the style of different composers. Now, while Cope's music sounds pretty good, the issue that I have with his music from a researcher's perspective is that he actually doesn't share much details about his models, and that he does a lot of cherry picking and post-processing. Okay. So while he might generate some basic notes, he might change them a lot, do a lot of additions and corrections to them. So you're not able to assess the true input of contribution of the computer. Okay. Here's a nocturne composed in Chopin style by Cope. It's pretty nice. So another system we have is by Francois Pachet. It's called the Continuator. Pachet used to be the lead scientist at Sony Computer Music Research in Paris, but he recently became head of a music generation department at Spotify. And his work basically is a system that is based on Markov models and sometimes also factor oracles, depending on which version. And it's an interactive system that basically extends the ability of musicians to play with a computer-generated musician. So here's a demo. Basically what the system does is it remembers what you just played and it'll remix and play it back to you. So it's also a pretty cool system, and it doesn't always only work with MIDI from a piano. It actually also works with audio waveforms, so you can use the system in a saxophone. I've seen some videos as well. Now, Elaine Chu with Isaac Shankler and Alexander Francois took the system one step further, and they thought, well, a musician needs to know what the computer is going to play so that they can interact together. So Mimi actually visualizes what the computer is about to play. So the screen will show you the notes that the computer will be playing in the future. So now the computer will start playing. So these types of systems really allow musicians to play together with an interactive AI system. Okay. There's some other systems like the Improviser from Bob Keller, which has different plugins and allows you to experiment with different things like deep belief networks, probabilistic grammars, and you can say, generate me the chords, generate me a melody line over these chords and use this algorithm. It's a free tool. It's pretty cool to try it out as well. And then we have the modern day systems. Okay, a Juke Deck, which was actually bought by ByteDance, who own TikTok, is a very cool music system. They're based in London, and on the website you can basically select, I want to hear pop music of this mood, of this duration, and then it creates the track in a few minutes for you, and that actually sounds pretty good. It's pop music, so it's very mellow, but it's a very nice system. I wouldn't be surprised if we see this adding on to TikTok's functionality very shortly. Okay, so today AI is really a trending field. We have all of these startups doing AI. We have Google Magenta, the big project on creating a library for TensorFlow for music generation. TensorFlow is the big deep learning library from Google. And you might have even seen the Bach Doodle, which was created by Anna Wang, which allows you to harmonize some melody that you give in. So what are we still doing in this field? We can tackle different kinds of problems. Like before, you heard piano music, you've heard string quartets, you've heard lead sheet generation. They're all different functions. Plus, they might be constrained to things like a narrative. Think of video game music, movie music, etc. Or we might be interacting with a live performer, so there's different categories in what task you're tackling. Then we can use different approaches, like a rule-based approach, like say, if you play this, then do this. Or you can take an optimization approach, which we'll talk about later, or a more statistical model, which includes the deep learning models of today, which are very popular, and these are the ones that are really bringing the field out there. Now what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk about a few of these tasks with examples of how it is generated without going into too much technical detail. So I'll start with rules, because rules are the most simple. Okay. Well, simple. When I started my PhD, I explored counterpoint music, fifth species to be exact, because it's one of the most formally defined musical styles. These rules were written by Johann Fuchs in 1725, and basically they were intended as an educational system to teach composers how to compose, so they're built up gradually. So I spent a lot of time digging through these books, finding the rules and creating mathematical formulations of them. Okay. The approach would be that composing music is basically an optimization problem. We have to find the right combination of notes so that the piece sounds good, and that here I can define as none or as few as possible rules are broken. Okay, so this is a luxury because not for all musical styles do we have these rules. Okay. So I dug through these books and I found 19 melodic and 19 harmonic rules. This is an example of a rule. Each large leap should be followed by stepwise motion in the opposite direction. Meaning we have a large leap. This is not stepwise motion, so this one would get a penalty point. This is a large leap, stepwise motion in the opposite direction. Great. This one does not violate any rules. So there's a quick formula to calculate this, and each penalty point, each time a rule is broken, the piece gets a penalty point. There's an overview of my rules. If you're interested, check out my publications. And then we use something called meta-heuristics, which is a way to find the best notes while trying to minimize or break as few as the rules as we can. This is not intended to be a technical talk, so I won't go into this, but you might have heard things like genetic algorithms or ant colony optimization. We use a search-based heuristic called variable neighborhood search. Okay. Basically, if we were to represent all musical pieces as points on this grid, then some of the pieces would have high penalty, some of them would have low penalty. And our aim is we start from a random piece, which might be here, and we take small steps so that hopefully we lower the penalties at each step and we finally arrive in a global optimum. It's as simple as that. And the moves we take, starting from this random piece, so we're going to swap two notes, changing the pitch of one note, changing the pitch of multiple notes being played at the same time. Okay, that's it. So if you want to look at it very methodologically, we start from a random solution, we perform the moves until no better solution is found, we switch to other moves, swap move, slice move, and we might perform some perturbation like shaking the solution a bit. If we get stuck, then we're going to randomly change a few notes so that we are able to move again in the right direction on this plane. So the result sounds something like this. Okay, apologies, it's a MIDI performance, but it breaks not too many rules. I think it's acceptable. Right, so this is great, but it has a big limitation, right? Because we need these rules. And for pop music, for Rachmaninoff piano music, I don't have the rules, right? So we need to move towards something that we call machine learning. And one possible thing is we could machine learn this penalty function that we're trying to optimize. So actually I created a small variation of this algorithm and I added some rules related to certain composers using machine learning to this previous system and implemented it as a little app, which I'm not really sure it still runs on modern day Android phones because this was 2013. You can give it a go. Now, this research started in the 1950s. Why don't we listen to generated music on our phones? Right? Because there's still some things that machines aren't able to do well. Long-term structure. If a song sticks to your ear or you have an earworm, it's because you have a certain theme or repeated sequence in your head. And currently, we're still very much struggling with how to get that into generated music. Secondly, has any of you ever watched Star Trek? So many years in the future, we have an android called Data, and data still struggles to understand emotion. Okay. Emotion really is something very difficult for machines to grasp. It can be difficult for humans even. So, because music and emotion are so intrinsically connected, it can be very hard for the generated music to actually have this tension and release or have this emotional quality to it. So this is another of the challenges that we are trying to tackle in our research. So in MorpheuS, we're looking at these two challenges. First of all, controlling emotion. To be able to do this, we first need to be able to capture emotion. And we're going to focus on a particular aspect of emotion called tonal tension. Okay. Emotion can come from, and even tension can come from many things: the rhythm, the loudness, the timbre, the instrument it was played on, but we'll be focusing on tonal tension. Okay. Now this is important, let's say, for music in video games, film background. Here's an example. Tense music and an emotional release. Okay. So if we want to be able to generate music for these purposes, then we'll need to be able to control the tension in music. Now, we made use of a model of tension by Elaine Chu, my supervisor back in London. And Elaine Chu has created this spiral array model of tonality. On this array, which is depicted on the right, we have 3 helixes, one for pitches, notes, and keys. And each position on this array will represent, let's say, pitch, key, or chord in this tonal space. And this has been used in the past for things like key detection, chord detection, or finding key boundaries. We have leveraged it for tension. Okay, so we've defined 3 aspects of tension that we can measure using this array. First of all, we're looking at the pitch array here, pitch helix here. All of the pitches have a place on this array. We can represent them in this tonal space, and their position will give some indication on how tonally related they are. For instance, C and D, a fifth apart, very close together. C and E, major third, also very close together in the array. Okay, C and C sharp quite far away because they don't belong to the same key. So, first of all, to calculate this tension, we divide the piece into equal length windows, okay, which we call clouds. For each of these clouds, we can then calculate the tension metric. For instance, we have the biggest diameter of this cloud. In the case of a C major triad, this diameter is pretty small. In the case of a C diminished triad, which is more tense chord, the diameter becomes larger. So we can easily say that this chord is more tense. Another metric has to do with movement in tonality. So the cloud momentum basically first takes the chord or the cloud. We're playing first C here, and we calculate the center of this chord so we can reduce it to 1 point. And the center is then related to the chord that is played next. The next chord is a C sharp major, which is about here. And we see that the center of these 2 chords are actually quite far apart. Okay. So there's a big movement in tonality, which can cause tension. And then finally, the last metric we've defined, or measure we've defined, is a tensile strain. Now each key has a position in this array. For instance, C major is located here. And this is great because we have this model. We have these positions that have been calculated, and a whole PhD thesis has been devoted to that. So we have the location of the C major key. Then we can calculate the distance of the center of each chord, let's say C major, very close to the C major key, and A minor, pretty close still to the C major key. That makes sense. C sharp major, quite far away from the C major key. So this is great. This is just what we need in computer science. We need a model that can give us numbers about how tonal things are, how much tension is in things. Okay. Here's a famous example of a very tense chord, the Tristan chord. It comes from Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde, and it's basically played each time the Tristan character appears on stage, and it's meant to convey this tension surrounding this character. Okay. The chord itself, if we represent it in our array, is very stretched out, you see. So the cloud diameter, as you see when it's played, is huge. There's also a big cloud momentum, and this little fragment here is actually far away from the key overall. I'll play it for you. Right, so our model captures that this is a tense moment. Here's another example. This is the German sixth chord, very comparable, stretched out in the spiral array, and here you see where it's played. Okay, so the second aspect was the long-term structure. How do we capture long-term structure? Okay, first of all, we can generate short-term music without a problem. That's pretty easy. Okay, for instance, we did a little paper on creating guitar solos using integer programming, a mathematical technique, and it's easy to create short-sounding things that sound good. Apologies for the MIDI sound. Right? But here we need to be able to capture the longer term structure so we can actually make a 3-minute song that makes sense. Okay. To be able to generate it, first we need to be able to measure it. Okay. So I use something called CausaIATAC, which is basically a compression algorithm. And CausaIATAC can detect, so this is a representation of a song over time and pitch height. So these dots are all pitches. And CausaIATAC finds repeated patterns. They can be transposed, but they're exact replications of each other. Okay, at least these two. So great. We're able to measure how much structure and where the structure is in a piece. Now our algorithms can learn from this. By the way, for those of you interested, this works in a similar way as zip file compression works. It finds repeated strings and replaces it with a smaller character. Here's an example. In this piece, there's a clear movement which is repeated here, and this descending movement here is also repeated there, which is represented in these repeated patterns. The red one first and the green one after. Right, so we can now measure tonal tension, we can measure long-term structure. So how does MorpheuS put it all together for generation? So we define our problem as we need to find new pitches, but we constrain ourselves to using the same repeated patterns. How the pattern looks can be different, but it needs to occur in the same positions throughout the song. And then our objective function here, this is a hard constraint, this one. Our objective is to match the tension profile that we input or from a template, an existing song, to our generated one. Okay. Here's an example of the resulting system. We use a variable neighborhood search again to optimize. You all know this piece. First step, we keep the patterns, we fill it up with random notes. but we repeat the random notes where they were repeated before. Pretty random. Okay. So now let's optimize it. And we optimize the tension, the emotion, to be more like the previous piece. It's not so bad. And this is interesting because you know the original piece and this sort of violates your expectations at certain points. So that gives it an extra interesting approach. I have some other examples here. For instance, this is based on Bach's March in D major. And a generated piece. So I really should give credit to Prof Elaine Chu, who performs all these pieces. Okay. Now, one last example, which is based on the Haydn Stolen series. Okay, you might all be familiar with Haydn's Sonata in E flat, which was the inspiration for all this. And there was a piece composed by Elaine Chu, Peter Child, and Grunley called Practicing Haydn, which was basically how you would practice it, right? So you go back, you play a little bit, you go back, and you make some mistakes, but it's all scripted, so it's all written out in full. The same piece was also used by Cheryl Frances Hote in her Stolen Rhythm piece, which was basically keeps the rhythm of this piece, but put other pitches, very much like MorpheuS does. So this is a concert series performed by Elaine Chu again. If you're interested to hear more pieces of MorpheuS, check out my website. There's a bunch of them. So Practicing Haydn is really inspired by the sounds of an orchestra warming up, practicing a piece. Okay, so it's provoking thinking about how to pay attention to music and how to listen to music. So what is the original song? So let's listen to Practicing Haydn. Very much like the original piece, but some practice in there. Now, Stolen Rhythm was actually created for the centenary celebration of Haydn, okay, by Cheryl Frances Hote. Let's hear how it sounds. And then finally, there's a MorpheuS piece. Okay. So it's pretty cool to see this evolution of this piece and how it has inspired other pieces. Okay. Now recently MorpheuS was actually put against a piece composed by Zanye at the conservatory here in a Channel News Asia documentary.
These musicians are rehearsing for an extremely unusual performance. In an hour, they will perform 2 compositions for a small audience.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this special recording. My name is Nikki, and I'm from the Singapore Symphony Group.
And a panel of judges. The experts are here to judge the music created by 2 different composers. Composer 1 was inspired by renowned musician Joseph Haydn, and composer 2 by Igor Stravinsky.
The pieces will be judged based on how well each composer interpreted their respective original composers.
They are being judged on how well they can write original works in the styles of Haydn and Stravinsky.
Please sit back and enjoy the performance. Musicians, please.
In this battle of tunes, the 2 composers will be judged on playability of piece, orchestration, or how the piece uses instruments, and the style, or how well it's written. But here's the catch. One of these pieces was composed by MorpheuS, and MorpheuS isn't a human being. MorpheuS is one of us, an algorithm. There are thousands of other algorithmic composers like MorpheuS who can even write music, poems, and paint.
Who thought that the computer wrote Haydn?
You?
Yeah. The rest thought the computer wrote Stravinsky.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
I think for everyone, the Haydn was the highest score, right?
Actually, not for me.
Really?
Right, so there were some interesting discussions on did MorpheuS create Haydn or not. In the end, we created Stravinsky. If you're interested in having MorpheuS create a piece for you to perform, you send me a template piece and then we can see what we can do. So what about the future of music generation? How can we fully model music so that we don't need this template? Because really with MorpheuS, we're morphing pieces, existing pieces. How can we do it without this existing piece? The current research in my lab explores the use of deep neural networks for this task. Okay. One approach is to use something called LSTM, or long short-term networks. We combine LSTMs with convolutional neural networks. You might have heard of this. These are networks that have transformed the field of vision. They've made possible computer face recognition, cat-dog classification of images, etc. But our challenge always is this time aspect. That's really what makes music different from images. So what we have seen in the past is people use images of piano rolls. It's okay, but we thought we need a more clever representation of music. So what we did is we basically transformed the music into a video of representations that capture some musical information, such as the tonets representation. In the tonets, again, musically, tonally close notes are close together here. So this actually worked pretty well. So we represented it as a matrix here, and the convolutional neural network is able to learn like this kind of thing needs to happen often or not. Okay. If you're interested in this, you should check out my website. You can actually use it. Okay. What we saw is that in our neural network, we indeed find, so these adjacent notes have a higher importance. Okay. Also, major thirds seem to have a higher importance. Okay. And if we generate music using this notation versus a piano roll representation, we see that we have, it's depicted in the picture here, we have lower tension, like lower tonal tension or less disharmony, and we have a higher compression ratio, which means that there's more patterns inside our music than compared to a piano roll. Okay. So this is all very, very intriguing. Here's an example of generated music. I'm sorry, we didn't really encode note duration, so the repetitions are a bit funny. So without any kind of constraint whatsoever, the neural network is able to learn something like this. So where are we now? There's a lot of groups working on different deep learning neural networks. Okay. We've summarized this recently in our survey paper, and we found that some of these have really good results. For instance, the music transformer, which uses a very new way of representing information, notes as events, and these sort of event representations seem to work very well. Here's an example of music transformer, which was an intern at Google who created it. It's very nice, right? So if we're thinking back of the Iliac suite and where we've come today, there's really a lot of advances. Okay. Now, an important aspect that I think that we need to keep when we're doing this music generation is control. We need to come to co-creative systems where you as a composer can sort of leverage this music generation system. Okay, you can create samples, you can create your structure based on a sample that you provide. It should be a tool or an assistant for you. This is my vision. So we're hoping to create this fully controllable music generation system. Okay. So this is one of our focuses at the AMAAI lab at SUTD. Okay. And we have a few systems that we're currently working on. For instance, music fader nets. Fader nets try to find or try to map hidden musical features. You basically feed the neural network. This is sort of a network. We don't know what's going on. It's a neural network. We feed it notes, and we try to force it to reconstruct the notes that we feed it. This is what we call an autoencoder. Now, there's a very complex statistics used inside, and it forces the discriminator here to disentangle different high-level musical features. Okay, you can then use these as, think of them as musical sliders. Okay, you can, in our case, we disentangled rhythmic density, note density, and arousal or energy levels of the music. So when you're generated, you can sort of change the values of these, and your output music will be different. Okay. Compare it with a music fader net. Okay. So what we can do with these things is we can really control how our output music sounds in terms of arousal, rhythm, etc. You can listen to some examples on our GitHub. Everything is available there. But I don't think we have too much time to go into details. Our main project now is lead sheet generation. Lead sheet is really a form of musical notation which has chords and melody. Okay. So we use big data sets and we encode this into, again, a neural network whereby we use LSTM, these models that can capture long-term structure. We're experimenting with attention networks as well. And novel thing here is we have conditions that we feed it. Okay, so conditions are mood or emotion annotation and other musical parameters like key, beat, meter, etc. So what we do first, we have 2 stages. We generate the chords and their rhythm first, conditioning based on some of these parameters. And interestingly, the mood, I think, is the most important one, so it can be used in, let's say, a video or a game context. And based on these chords, we then generate the melody. Okay. So here are some examples of this system. High valence music. So it's supposed to be pretty cheerful. Neutral. And then finally we have low valence. Right, so we need to keep in mind that we want to be able to control this music. So we're going towards a high level system, and that's why we want to offer our system as like a plugin for most common audio software. We're currently working on compiling this, because if we take the last example, it's not finished music. I did some production of this on this last fragment, and you can easily make it sound like this. Right, so it's all in the production, right? So we're really aiming for this co-creative system. We want to offer a tool that you can plug in into your Logic Pro or your Reason, and then that can help you create a more complete song. I should mention that this project is led by Dimos Makris. We have Kat Agris from NUS working on this, as well as Nicolas Guo. So what can we conclude from this? Machine learning has brought us a range of new possibilities when it comes to music generation. Okay. There's been this whole revolution, really, from back when Ada Lovelace first mentioned the idea of music generation to where we are now, where Google has a whole team devoted to this. Okay. There are, however, still challenges. How do we capture long-term structure? How do we get emotions in the music? How do we co-create with the music so that the computers can augment our jobs, not just replace it? And perhaps, how can we come to a finalized production environment where we can work joint with these tools? Okay. With these thoughts, I leave you. And if you have any questions, do contact me. You can find my contact details on my website and some more information about the project that we're working on as well. I hope you enjoyed it.